All right. All right.
I'm gonna go mute. Thank you.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, sorry about that. My family just had this random thing. They're like, "Oh, we're doing iftar dinner, and you have to come." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." Like, so that was yesterday. All right. So I think Janelle sent me some topics to cover. So routing with Express and handlebars, each callback functions and SQLized queries. So let's start off on the top. So Janelle, is that correct?
Q6 in the cloud. Well, you know what? We can see what everybody else wants. I don't want to hog it. Those are just the things I wanted to go over.
I'm going to post it here because I asked people to send me stuff ahead of time, and those are what I prioritize. So if you want that, that's what we're going to do.
Fine by me. That's what I need.
Good night, mush. And good night.
What is in the background, you know? Good night, mush.
Yeah, mush.
Mush.
HQ, $200,000 trivia game prize.
Oh, yeah, everyone's been talking about that. Okay. All right.
Oh, but I'm out, so it doesn't matter. I didn't know it was mush.
It's okay. Okay. So I guess everyone agrees, so let's just go on with it. All right. Let's see, where, let me share my screen. So let's go through express routing. So we have the application that we did, which was, let's see, SQLize. Actually, now that we're starting into project 2, I'm going to use the example of Travel Secure. That's okay. So routing, what happens is if you have an application, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to go to your main file when a request is being made. The request can be made via AJAX, or it can be done through an HTML form, or the request can be made a number of different ways if it's not from the client side. From the client side, it can only be done 2 different ways. If it's not from the client side, it can be done multiple ways. So if the request is being made, it's going to be sent to one of these. Brad, I'm not too loud, am I? Nope, I guess if they can't hear me now, then I'm okay. Right. So I have the server.js is going to be one of the files that I go to. But in the case of this application, I'm using bin and this file over here, because that's how Express Generator, which is another node package which generates the Express application for you with certain structure. This generates this file. That's how we do it. But this is very similar to what we do on server.js, except you just require the server here, you call the models from here, and you set the app and SQLize over here as well. So essentially, you do a lot of these setup for the application over here. And then anything that occurs just purely on the server is in server.js. So anything that's just Express exists over here. So once the request is made, it's then going to go through any middleware. So we have all our middleware under app.use, right? So app.use is going to be any of this stuff, right? So app.use is going to be any of that. App.use is going to be any of this. So all of this is going to be hit first before it hits any of the routes. You guys following me so far? Post thumbs up or thumbs down, or yes or no into the chat. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do here is after I go through any middleware, so if it's a static file, remember your static files are all going to go through express.static, right? So any kind of routing that's not processed, that's like, hey, I just need this, give it back to me, that's going to go through express.static, and that exists in the public folder. So any client-side JavaScript files, any client-side CSS files, or even static HTML files, if you just need them to be displayed back to you, that's going to exist in public. All right, now we're going to go to routing. Right? So we go to routing, and that's going to exist in the routes folder. Or sorry, before we get to the routes folder, it's going to exist in the routes file. So remember our ship analogy. You have a ship, and it needs to know where in the dockyard to go to, where it needs to dock to, right? So the routes file is the main ship master, right? It says, okay, this is where you need to go to, and then another person will then route you to exactly where that needs to execute. So our first ship master, or dock master, if you will be in this routes file. Right, so we pass in this Express application that was instantiated here, we pass it into routes, right? So we go to there, and you notice this routes file over here, that's what we're gonna go to. And notice that because of this, we're able to pass in that app. So it passes it in, and again, this is all pre-routing. So even though this is in the routes file, because we're still using app.use, this is all still before any routing is actually hit. So it's saying anytime you're using route, go to this route. Anytime you're using this, go to this route. Anytime you're going here, still go to this route, et cetera, et cetera. So this is basically just mapping it, saying like, okay, if you wanted to go to this route, you're this person, okay, or this ship, you're gonna go here, all right? So it's directing you to the specific route to go to. So let's say that we made a request to trips. We'd go to routes/trips because that's what we decided that it's gonna go to, right? Any request that it's gonna be trips, app.use is saying anything with trips is gonna go to this over here, all right? Are we good so far? Yes or no?
Omar, can you just, the name of the file that you just looked at, that was routes, right?
Yes, correct, that was routes.
That's
Routes.js.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Okay, so going to the next part. So we have, so now we have our routes. So let's say that we made a request for a GET request to trips. So we know that it was mapped to trips.js. So it told us to go to this file. It says, okay, now you need to talk to this person. So we're now moving our ship along, and it's saying, go to this specific location. It's like, okay. So now we have the ship master that is in charge of that location and saying, okay, so all trips are going to come to me, and I'm going to tell you what to do when you get to these. All right, you're going to execute this thing. Controller is saying to do these following things, right? So I'm essentially, well, I shouldn't say telling you. I'm getting you there. The routes file is like getting you, and then the controller is then saying, this is what I want you to execute, right? So when we get to this part, notice that we're using express.router. We don't want to instantiate all of Express just to use routing, because this is the actual routing part. Up to now, we've just been using middleware. So right now when we do routing, notice that routes have this HTTP method, get and post. So we use the HTTP methods that are also just part of router because that's all we need right now. And then we say, okay, so this is going to be just /trips, right? There's no path after it. This is /trips/new. So when you're trying to create new trips, this is what would happen. Questions about that?
Hi, Omar?
Yep.
I'm having problems with my connection. Can you record this? And if you, I might be disconnected soon. If you could just go through when you have a chance, like let's say step by step when you're doing the, what is it, the CMV? Hold on, I have a note. What's this, the
MVC, right?
Yeah. Can you go through like basically like let's say step 1 through 12 on what's important when setting that up, what you look for and what to do?
Yeah, can you add that to the chat as because we're first going to go through this list that that was sent to me earlier by Janelle, and then we can go through MVC after. So just remind me after we go through each callback functions and SQLized queries. I'll go through that.
Okay. I just have a feeling my connection's not going to last, so I'm going to try to get this in.
Yeah, so just paste it here. Okay, so otherwise, are we good on the concepts so far? Okay, cool. So these routers are basically saying, okay, so this is where routing is actually going to occur, right? So this routing happens, and after this routing happens, I have something else. Don't worry about this is authenticated. If you guys are interested in authentication, you guys can take a look at this, but basically this is executing before it hits the other function. All right, so this check will run, this function will run first before it goes to this. So if I'm just making a GET request to trips, then this route is going to be hit, correct? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this function called index. And so in order to see what index is, I'm going to go and say, oh, okay, trips controller.index. Where's that coming from? Oh, I required it in trips controller. So trips controller, let's see. Brad, are you killing a lot of the bad guys? Are you killing a lot of bad guys? Custodians?
No, it's just, he's just not good.
Oh.
Hector's dead.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Crow should have been dead.
He's a beast.
The bike that was attacking, 4-1.
See, you guys, if you're a programmer, you get luck on your side. All right. So let's see. We're not going to models. We're going to controllers. Oh, I did go to controllers. Why did it look? Oh, no, I was in the right place. Okay. So we go to trips controller. And over here, we have two functions, right? We have index and we have create trip. So index, what it does is it has the following. So if I wanted to execute index, what happens is I'm going to then call something from models. So we get everything from models. And then we have available to us the database.trip model. And again, because we're using the model, we can just say, okay, call this specifically on the model. And this is using SQLized, right? This db.trip.findAll, that's all through SQLized. The models are generated through SQLized. These methods are executed through SQLized. So I call this db.trip.findAll. And what that does is it's going to execute a query onto my database, which is MySQL, based on find all where user ID is equal to the user ID passed in. So I'm basically just doing select all from the trips table where user ID is equal to user ID that we passed in. All right. Now on the callback, right? So this is the promise that's being returned. So showing the information being displayed. So after that information is queried from the database. And can everyone please put their stuff on mute? Thanks. So Eric, had you on mute? So I have the response, and what I do here is after I get that information that's coming back from the MySQL database through SQLized, what I do is I render this handlebars file. So this handlebars file is being rendered, and what's being passed to it is an object with two different properties. One is the layout, because I don't want the same layout as before. The default layout, if I didn't pass in this property, then what happens is the value is going to be the main trips, which is something that I'm explicitly being passed in. The second is the trip. So the trip is essentially just saying, I'm going to pass in this array of objects, right? How are you guys feeling about this understanding now? Up to this part. So let's do fist of 5 1, I don't understand it at all. 5, I'm doing great. Okay. So those are feeling about 3. Where would you feel like the confusion is? And you can unmute yourselves.
I have one small question. Okay, on this, when it says layout and trip, you know that's a handlebars because you know it's handlebars already by seeing the files, or you know it's handlebars because it says layout?
Oh, this is all handlebars because I'm using render, and I set my rendering engine to be handlebars. So that's in the setup part. So remember when we say app.set engine?
Yes.
That's my rendering engine. So anytime I use render, it's going to go through handlebars.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No problem. Others who felt. So Eric, Sean, if you guys feel like 3, 3.5, what specifically? This is where we can take time to go into granular details.
Okay, cool. So we're just going through the MVC like connection right now about how all the files are interconnected. Oh, sorry, I was a little bit late to the meeting. What specific topic are we covering right now?
Right now we're covering Express with handlebars, I believe. Express with handlebars and routing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm good then. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So once we get that information, this DB trip is going to be passed into this file. So this file exists inside of views. Whenever we render something, that's going to go through views. So we go to views. And we go to, what the fuck is it? Trips and handlebars. And it's being passed in here. So we pass all that information into here. So again, we just passed in that single object with layout and trip as properties. So the property of trip has an array of objects. That array of objects gets opened up. So we say, okay, we loop through this array of objects and we look through each object, which is just a row being passed in. First, we check, okay, does this array of objects exist? If it does, then do this, right? Otherwise, you might see some weird things, right? You want to do a simple conditional statement to check to make sure all that information is coming in. If it does, then you loop through that trip and it'll display the information inside of it wherever you want. And that's a simple GET request through a basic application in Express with handlebars. So did that help? Yes, no, maybe so. Is that what you were asking about? Okay. So let's go to the next part. So each, so the each part, were you talking about the each inside of handlebars or each as something else? I noticed you mentioned each. So each is in a variety of different places. Each in handlebars. Okay, so did that make sense when I just happened to have gone through each right now as an example, but that is how each works. So in handlebars, if I go through trips and I go here, each only works on arrays. So I loop through this array and the array is going to be opened up if they're objects, and I now have access to the properties of each object. So for example, the property is data values, and I can access a value of another property of that if that property happened to be another object as well. So this just happened to come back in that format.
Hi, this is Jane again about the last one with the each in it.
Yeah.
What is a good way of checking to make sure it's working? Do I console log it? Do
Yes.
I do that? Okay.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So there's 2 ways of doing server-side debugging One is console log. Another one is using the debugger. So I actually included the debugger. So if you use what I use, which is oh, actually, you know what? What you're asking is something that I'm not answering properly. What you're asking for is, when I want to see things come out properly, what method do I use? And I'm talking about debugging. To see what you want to see, I would just use console logging from the server side. If there's any issues or errors, then I would use the debugger.
Okay. Okay. Got that. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. There are other commands that you can use other than if and each, and they exist, but there's not many. So again, handlebars should not be handling a lot of logic. It should just be handling what's coming back. So handlebars, helpers. Where the hell is it? Oh God, this is another library. Handlebars, if each, or if. There we go, built-in helpers. There's if, unless, each, with. I don't think I've ever used if or with. Lookup, log. Yeah, that's pretty, I mean, there's only a few. So if you want to look up like all the built-in helpers, it's like maybe 6 or 7 of them. Am I too loud? No? All right. Sorry, I'm actually at a friend's house right now, so I want to make sure. Huh? I'm paranoid? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I don't want to be a jerk. More than I already am. I mean, I'm not a jerk. I'm an asshole. There's a difference. No, dude. Completely different. Okay, so that is it for that one. Callback functions. Okay, so in terms of callback functions, if you take a look at the example we had for 05 Sequelize library, so we did that the other day. I think that was on Saturday. Yes, we did this. No, sorry, Wednesday and Thursday. So if you take a look at this activity, and you guys don't have to open it up, but these are all callback functions. So we have this callback function over here. And this callback function executes only after this is finished. So a callback function is basically any function that executes after a process is finished executing. So it's basically just another piece of functionality that runs after something else is finished. If you're running this in any programming language, essentially a callback function is conceptually the same. So this is a typical callback function. Now, this is using a it's basically using a callback function, except a newer way of writing callbacks is to use promises. So a promise is like, I promise I'm going to have something return within my anonymous function that I pass into my promise. So whenever I use then, I'm saying, okay, I promise I'm going to have this information in there. So then basically the best part of it is that you can just make it so instead of having to write deeply nested callback functions, you can just keep doing this. Sorry. So this looks a lot nicer than having to continuously tab 2 spaces, go deep into a callback function, tab 2 spaces, go deep into a callback function, tab 2 spaces, go into a callback function. And it basically just clears up a lot more of your logic flow, which is super important as you start having huge applications. Was that what was the question about? And did that clear it up or did it not clear it up?
So are there 2 callback functions within this example that you're showing right now? There's the callback function of function with the parameters request and response, and then function result, right?
Well, this is actually not a callback function. This is a callback function. This is a type of callback function called a promise. And that is it. So technically you are correct in that there are two forms of callback functions within here. But this you would call a promise, and this you would call a simple callback function.
I see. I got you. All right, cool.
But you are correct in the concept of it. Promises are very specific to JavaScript.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, no worries. SQLized queries. Okay, so this one is big. Let's go to SQLized queries. So let's go to my application. So JavaScript. Let's go to controllers. And let's go to some of these. Wait, what am I going to use? And why? Yeah. There we go. So let's go to more complex SQLized queries. So actually, this isn't even that complex. That's okay though. All right. So when I sign up a new user, I have a controller for that. So I have the controller that's that has sign up user, login user, sign out user, and registration page. So when someone clicks to register and they go to registration page, it'll render the registration page. And then when they click on the submit button, it's going to use an AJAX function to then make a request that will then eventually get to this controller, which will go to sign up user. So the form is going to send all this information. Now, notice that this is just using rec.body.username. So it's just basically using the rec.body stuff, right? So first, it's going to find all. So the way SQLized queries work are you're going to be using the database object, the model name, and then the method. So the database object, you're going to get imported when you're using the required models. Now, we haven't gotten to SQLized CLI yet, but we're going to do it on Monday and Tuesday. And you'll see how this DB object actually is a collection of other objects, including the models. So you have access to all the other models and all of their functionality when you use the CLI. So we'll cover it on Monday, Tuesday, but just wanted to let you guys know that we are going to cover this a little bit more. So next we have the part that's the method. So the method exists as part of the ORM, right? And the ORM that we're using is SQLized. So we have db.user.findAll, and it's saying select all from the user table where, and then what I'm doing is I'm passing in this object that's username, and I'm saying the username is going to be rec.body.username. So this is being parsed using body parser. So when the submit call was made from the client side to the server side read this using body parser, saved it in rec.body, and I'm using it to read it first. Now the reason that I'm making this query using the username first is before I create a new user, I want to make sure that it's not a duplicate user, right? I want to make sure that username doesn't already exist in the database. So if it already exists in the database, then I'm going to say, okay, well, if the return that I get back from this is a length of greater than 0, then I'm going to send back a JSON object with a simple property that says duplicate user equals true. So I have an event listener on my client side that says, after the AJAX call is done, it's going to listen for this. So if there's a duplicate user, then it's going to say, I'm sorry that username is taken. Please use a different username. So it's actually going to look through the database when you make that submit call. Now, there are fancier ways of doing this, right? You can actually make it so it makes the submit call as you're typing in the username. So let's say that someone's typing something in and it waits 1 second, maybe a little bit more, and then it checks and it's like, username already exists. You can't use that, rather than having to put all the information in and then hitting submit, right? There are ways of doing that. It's not too difficult, but we won't go into that right now. All right, if the username doesn't exist, then we're going to create that. So again, we're using that format of SQLized queries, which is the DB object, then the user, and then we're going to do create. Right? So create is another method that's inside of SQLized. is going to create the following information. Again, getting the information coming from the client-side request. The client-side request is going to have the following. It's read by the body parser, right? So the body parser is going to read all this information. It's going to see the username, email, password, and you're storing it in this new object called, well, it doesn't have a name, but it's going to contain username, email, password. After it gets created, then what we're doing is this callback function, which is just a promise. The promise is going to say, okay, if it's successful, redirect back to the home page. So what's going to happen is it's going to then redirect you back to the home page, which is the root path, and it's going to refresh that page. If there's an error, it's going to catch that error, and it's going to send that error back to the client side to display however which way I want to see it. Does that help with understanding how SQLized queries work? And if not, what is the confusion? Hello, puppy. Hello, puppy. Hi, baby. Hi, baby. Oh, look, puppy. Oh. Little cutie. Little cutie. You're so cute. Okay. Hey.
Hey, Omar. Quick question. Does SQLized take the place of ORM? Is it just a different way to do ORM? Okay.
No, it is an ORM. It is an object relation.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
SQLized is that. Okay, so now we're going to go through MVC. So MVC is the concept of model view controller. So MVC I was looking through the wiki, and usually it's antiquated because this is like the antiquated version, but they actually have this little section of use in web applications. So they've actually updated it based off of how it's used nowadays. So so it says some web MVC frameworks take a thin client approach. This is reflected in frameworks such as Django, Rails, ASP, MVC. I don't know why they say some. Well, I guess it's only a few MVC frameworks, but these are like the biggest ones used, like Rails, ASP.NET, things like that. They're pretty big frameworks. They're used a lot. They also talk about AngularJS, Ember, JavaScript, MVC, Backbone. So we're going to get into this, as you guys are going to see when we get to React after Project 2. So it is going to tie into this. But they also have some cool parts on it that we mentioned before in here, which I thought was pretty cool because they usually, like a lot of these wiki articles, don't do that great of a job. But this one did a pretty good job. All right, let me see. There was a good picture of this as well. Let me see. Cool. So, so the concept, ours is a little bit more than this, though. I want routes to show. None of these are showing routes. Yeah, actually, this is good. Cool. All right. So this is actually pretty good. This includes the router. So let's say that we have our browser, right? Our browser makes a request to our server. So the server goes and accesses the middleware. So the middleware is going to then parse the information and return information if necessary. Otherwise, it's going to go then to the router. So the router is hit. The router is basically like, okay, where do we need to go to? So the router is like, okay, we need to go here. So again, we've separated routing out just like they have, because that's routing should just think, if you think about it semantically, routing is just routing. You're just trying to get to a place. That's what routing is meant for. Once it routes, it's going to go to the controller. Now the controller is going to directly interface with the model or the view. Notice that the model and the view do not interact directly. The model is going to interface with the database, but the controller is not going to directly interface with the database. It's going to do it through the model. So this is actually a good diagram. Here, let me actually send this. This is something like what I wanted. This is like a more modern approach to MVC. Okay, so we make all of our logic requests through the controller, and our logic flow is done through this controller. So remember when we went through our trips controller, we made a request to the model. The model came back with our information from the database, back from the model to the controller. We then use that information to then display something inside of the view. So this is very directly what we're using inside of the application. And that's basically all what MVC is on a very high level. Does that give you guys a good overview? Or did someone want to go more granular on a certain part?
Hey Omar, can you give us a quick example from a UI perspective of what we're seeing when it comes to like the MVC? Like obviously you don't want to show us like the database, but just like the process through that.
Yeah, do you want me to just click through an application and show you the different parts?
Yeah, just like say what exactly.
Yeah, so let me go to the live app. Actually, let me push something up too. Fuck. What is it? Projects. CLA projects. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Flags go before arguments. Get stage. Get stage. Should work. Oh, diff. Oh, that's fine. Okay. All right, so now I'm just going to push this to Heroku. Oh, Alex, did I win? I lost? You didn't table him? It's horrible. It's my students. They made me lose. Yeah. It's taking a long time to build. It shouldn't take this long. Okay, so now if I load this, it should have the latest version. Yeah, there we go. So here's the latest version that reflects all the information. See you, dude. GG. We'll get a real weekend someday. Yeah, that'd be nice. But good job on Custodies beating Ultramarines. Yeah.
Well, I think Cornel's he was stuck. He couldn't move. He couldn't fall back in combat. And I walked around the two predators in combat too, so they had to fall back and shoot. Yeah.
I need to really split them apart. Yeah.
All right.
All right. See ya. All right, guys. So if I go to Travel Secure, and you want to see, this is the view. So when I went to this link, the browser made a client-side request using Ajax to the server-side application. So if you want to see a one-to-one, then what will happen is I go to GitHub, Travel Secure. So a request is made to my application. It goes through bin, and this is the first file it looks for, and then it's going to go through here. It doesn't need to debug anything, so it goes to server. So we go to the server file, server.js, and it's going to go through all of the middleware first. So it's going to go through routes because we don't need to, it's going to go through all this middleware, but nothing needs to really be checked right now. So we're just going to go through routes first. It's going to pass the app into it. So we go to routes. And now, because we're at the root path, right? So we're still at root. And what's happening is it's going to then use the application router. So application router is being executed. So we then go to application router. So this is where actual routing takes place. So we go to application. And we're then going to say, oh, okay, well, it's a GET request to this. So I'm going to go to here. And this is what's going to execute on this router. So I'm going to go to application router or application controller now, .index. So this is the first part of the controller that's going to now take place. So this is routing so far in that diagram that I sent. And now this is the part where it's going to go to the controller part. So if we take a look at the diagram, so we're at routing right now, and now we're going to the controller. So controller now, we go to application controller, and notice that it's saying, okay, all we need to do is execute this res.render and render this index file. So it doesn't need to go through this model or database. It's just going to render this view, right? So we render this view. So this is the views part of MVC. And it's going to render this index file. And that's what you see over here. Does that make sense? Cool. So I did one using the model with the trips controller. So the ones with the trips controller that I went over earlier is after I logged in, I can go to this, make a simple request, goes to trips, and this is the result of that. So it went to the model, got all this information, came back to the controller then took that information in, sent it to the view then rendered this to the client side.
Cool, thanks, man. That makes sense.
Sure, no worries. So, any other questions?
It's Jane. I do have a question.
Sure.
It might be too long, but I'll see. If I was a pseudocoding Travel Secure, do I start with the folders and files and then fill those in, or do I do something else first, or how would I do it?
If you were pseudocoding this, yeah, I would start off with the structure and the files, and I would start putting things into those files. It's a good question. So yes, that is correct. You would start off with the files, and then, well, if you're from the very, very beginning, I would just have one file that would tell me like how I would be structuring the application, and then it would be how I'm going to be writing the code for that application.
And then in the pseudocode, how granular do you usually get there before it becomes too much code?
I don't get too granular. That's a good question too. So like what I try and do is I first start off on big picture and then I try and solve for that. So I solve for the big picture. It's like, okay, now we got that solved. So the structure is done. Now let's try and implement this one specific part, like, which is, this problem. And now, so I first try to identify what all the problems I'm trying to solve are. Once I identify what all of my problems I need to solve are, then I try solving for them one at a time. And as I try solving for them one at a time, I would then first write in the pseudocode for each of the solutions. And the solution would then just be like, oh, okay, now I can just write in the code based off of that pseudocoded solution.
Okay.
Does that make sense, or is that too confusing?
This would be long for this one, and you'd write quite a bit in this and then kind of like fill in as you go along. Is that right?
There would be a lot, yeah. So in this one, because I meant, like, this is why I wanted to make it easier for you guys. I already gave you guys a structure, so you would just follow the structure.
Okay.
For your applications for project 2, so you don't have to worry too much about structure. For implementation, that is something that you should still pseudocode, things like that. But a lot of it follows a certain format already, so you would use that format that I've used in my application.
Yes. Okay, good. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions?
I have it sort of off. It's about homework 14, the burger thing. It doesn't have a git ignore in it, and I was wondering, shouldn't it have a git ignore in it?
It should have a git ignore. That's weird. Yeah, I would put a git ignore in there if it does not have one already.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. All right. If there's no other questions, then let me stop the recording.